you very much. Well, everybody knows who this is by now. Imre-lakatos, without whose influence and guidance and inspiration I would have had no academic career. So it's a particularly great honour for me to have been involved in organising this celebration of him on the occasion of his centenary, and also to be giving this final lecture. One of the things I like about the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Imre is how much it emphasises the impact of Lakatos outside of philosophy, because I always think that's the most important thing. Philosophy, talking to itself is not a very edifying sight. It's always better when we have some impact outside. And Imre's a classic case of this. They select quotes at random 25 days in 2015. I'm sure this was designed to give them the impact they wanted. And there are a large number, 33 papers. I mean, philosophers don't get cited that often. This is quite an impressive number in 25 days. And as they point out, at most 10 qualify straight philosophy, the rest are devoted to such topics as educational theory, international relations, party, and lots of things. So Imre was very much more than a philosopher. And I hope that this conference, I know this conference has underlined that fact. We've had the plenary from Alison, and several of the contributed papers have been the impact of Imre's ideas, and particularly his NSRP, outside of philosophy. Sadly, I can only give you a talk about potential impact outside of philosophy. I wish I could give you a real one, and let me explain what I mean, however. What I'm going to do is indicate that, and I stress the indicate, rather than prove, that the defences of a pair of very high impact hypotheses in medicine both form clear-cut examples of degenerating research programs on Lakatos's terms, despite which they are, in particular the second one, massively believed in and used as a basis for treatment of billions of people worldwide. And it's my hope that by presenting the case against them in Lakatosian terms, and therefore linking it to cases in proper science, he said, irritatingly, physics, where degeneration has led to the demise of those hypotheses, it might strengthen the hand of those few skeptics that there are in medicine who challenge these hypotheses. Okay, so it's a potential impact rather than an actual one. That's the title of it. You'll see I'm going to give you some added internal, external history, thrown in entirely without charge at the end. I'll come to the medical cases very shortly, but first a few words about degeneration and ad hocness, which will be necessary for dealing with the issues I talk about in a clear way. Many people, including Paul Faraban, and this was something that Anya said actually as well, read Lakatos identifying the two notions as believing, in other words, that a shift in theory constitutes degeneration just in case the new theory is an ad hoc response to some experimental difficulty or anomaly for its predecessor theory. And Paul Faraban, having read it that way, well, he probably didn't read it, he heard about it because he didn't read very much of other people, but he probably heard that this is what Lakatos said and thought he could easily refute it by pointing to valuable hypotheses that were nonetheless quite plainly ad hoc. Well, you can't do that because Imre didn't mean that, at least not in this. If we just take ad hoc to mean what literally should it ought to be, is a hypothesis that you never would have thought of unless you were trying to defend this particular theory that's in some sort of trouble. There's nothing wrong with that, obviously. I like to think that Imre would have very much liked, although this paper was given at the Popper seminar 2 or 3 years after Lakatos's death, I like to think that by Alan Franklin, a distinguished historian of science, a friend of mine, I like to think that Lakatos would have liked the title. Ad hoc is not a 4-letter word. Of course, taken literally, it's trivially true. It's not it's 5 letters, not 4, and it's a phrase, not a word. But that wasn't Alan's thesis, otherwise it would have been a very short Popper seminar. It was exactly that there can be very valuable hypotheses that are ad hoc. It's not something that's automatically anti-scientific. Of course, that doesn't mean that some ad hoc hypotheses aren't also unscientific. My favourite example with apologies to those of you who heard me use this example, I don't know how many times through my career, 15 times probably. Actually, Alan Musgrave mentioned him on the film yesterday. Henry Goss, who wrote this book called Omphalos, an attempt to untie the geological knot, just 2 years before Darwin, so very much in the context of Darwin's publication, but obviously his ideas were already known, and so in the context of that discussion. Omphalos means navel, with an A, not an E. With an E, no. Anyway, whichever, navel in the sense of belly button, and it's 200 pages written on the deep issue of why it is that, given his non-standard method of production, Adam should have had a navel. He doesn't seem to think it's a problem that Eve had a navel, but although she had an equally unorthodox method of production. And after 200 pages or so, he comes to the conclusion, well, why shouldn't God have given Adam a navel? I mean, he moves in mysterious ways anyway, so it's just up to God what he does with his creation. And of course, he uses that to counter possible the objection from fossils and other things that were quite obviously older than 5,000 to 6,000 years old. The reason why they don't count against the theory that the universe was created in 4004 BC, because the idea being that God created lots of the things that he created already looking very old. Well, that's ad hoc. It's an ad hoc response to the problem, and it's obviously unscientific because it's made to be non-independently testable. But everybody's favourite example of a success story in science is the discovery of Neptune, which is involves an ad hoc hypothesis. And similarly, the Copernican account of no observable stellar parallax, perhaps I'll miss that out. But the discovery of Neptune, so Uranus was discovered purely observationally by sort of obsession or looking at the night sky and noting that something that was previously thought to be a fixed star was in fact moving against the background of fixed stars by Herschel. The Newtonians calculate what the orbit of Uranus should be, and they get it wrong. But Adams and Leverrier independently in Britain and in France, well, apparently independently, said no, Newton's theory must be right. It must be some initial condition, some alternative hypothesis that's wrong here, and obviously we need an expression of the total force acting on Uranus to feed in to give you the Newtonian prediction, and that in turn depends on an assumption about how many planets there are. What will happen if we assume that there's another planet that nobody's discovered? After all, Herschel's just recently discovered Uranus, so there could easily be another planet. And they work backwards from the assumption that Newton's theory is correct to a prediction about the existence of this new planet. So basically, let's forget that one. The key is not ad hoc or not, but rather independently testable or not. So a research program is progressive if and only if its successive theories are always independently testable in principle, and sometimes independently testable in practice, and they're confirmed in at least some of those independent tests. An RP is on the contrary degenerative if and only if I didn't like degenerative. It seems to be progressive, then you're going to say degenerative. Or if you're going to say degenerating, you should say progressive. But he wouldn't. He wanted progressive, but degenerating. But I'm going to annoy him posthumously by using degenerative. A word arose by any other name would smell as sweet after all. So an RP is on the contrary degenerative if and only if each new theory explains only the evidence that was anomalous for its predecessor and has no independent success. And we'll see in the medical cases that it's that second disjunct that's exemplified time and again. Because, we're not got on that. Meaning either that the new theory, it's got no independent success, means either that the new theory is not independent testable at all, as in the Goss case, or that it does make independently testable predictions, but those predictions are themselves falsified, requiring a further shift in theory that in turn has no independent predictive success, und so weiter. Okay, so now the medical example. Let me personalise it, as Anya did a bit with her talk on Wednesday. So I committed bloggery, I'm afraid to say, I fully admit, by producing a blog that was posted on the LSE webpage. If you're interested, it's that one. And it was about my experiences with, I had a fairly major stroke in March 2021. And the blog is about my resistance of taking statins. Well, I came out with a very high dose statin to be taken for lifelong out of Queen Square, where they treated me magnificently well, I have to say, as you see before you. But I resisted taking it, and the blog's the reason for it. Now, I had, hundreds of, well, let me be honest, I had twos and twos of responses to this. Two of them were exemplified more than once. One was, I've been taking statins for a long, long time. I've not had a heart attack, I've not had a stroke, and I've not got any side effects. My argument was basically there probably is, at least for people at so-called high risk, which I am, given I've already had a stroke, a tiny benefit to statins, but it's more than outweighed by the, well, it seems to be more outweighed. The problem is that people don't study negative side effects enough, but it seems to be outweighed by the risk of the negative side effects. So some people responded to this saying, okay, but I've been taking statins forever and for many years, and I've not suffered any ill effects. To which my response is they must have the constitution of an ox, because there's no doubt that statins do nasty things to your body, biochemically I'm talking now, apart from any actual manifestation of side effects. But the other one that's irrelevant to what I'm going to say, the main one that I want to talk about is another one that, okay, you convinced me. There were exactly two people who said this, actually. You convinced me, and so I went to my GP, let's make the GP female, and told her that I didn't want statins anymore, and she said to me, well, that's fine, but your cholesterol level is too high, so you've got to take something else. So the response was, tell me what I should take, rather than statins. Well, the reply to that is that there are alternative anti-cholesterol agents, for example, PCSK9 inhibitors, which were popular for a brief while, but taking those would, rather than statins, would be like jumping out of the frying pan into an altogether hotter fire, because PCSK inhibitors have massive side effects and are now hardly used at all. But they do reduce cholesterol much better, actually, than statins do. But anyway, the evidence, and this is surprising because it's contrary to something that every educated person knows. Everybody knows that a high cholesterol level is bad for you, and in particular it's bad for you in terms of your likelihood to get cardiovascular disease. That's what CVD means. I think the evidence strongly suggests, and I'm being polite really, that CVD is not caused by high cholesterol levels. Now, the full argument, so you shouldn't, the answer to your GP is, I don't want to be on anything, just leave me alone. The full argument for that judgment about the evidence is complicated and involves several features of which Lakatosh was unaware, because it's one of these awkward causal hypotheses that are patently multi-causal. The actual thing is multi-cause. We didn't discuss anything like that in philosophy of science back then. It was Newton, Galileo, Einstein, wave theory of light. All nice and deterministic, not these funny non-deterministic causal hypotheses. And it involves probabilities of which Lakatosh didn't have anything very sensible to say either. But there is a feature of it, of that judgment. So I won't be claiming to establish this judgment, only to indicate some reasons for thinking that it might be true, that it's not a good idea to take, to lower your cholesterol level, because it's not true. Likely not to be true that CVD is caused by high cholesterol levels. One important reason was something that Lakatosh did know in that judgment, did know an awful lot about, and that's degeneration. Okay, so let's come to the cholesterol hypothesis. Basically, it's also sometimes known as the heart diet meme, because it started out really in dietary theory, and the first claim was that a diet high in cholesterol and/or, again, there's lots of change and possible degeneration involved in all these things, but let me not worry about that. A diet high in cholesterol and or saturated fats causes high cholesterol levels. More importantly for us, a high cholesterol level, usually clarified as a high level of LDL, low density lipoprotein. You can't have a cholesterol level in your blood because cholesterol is not soluble in the blood. It has to hitch a ride on a complex protein called a lipoprotein, and it's the low density ones that have got fingered as the cause of CVD, which to remind you again means cardiovascular disease, basically heart attacks and ischemic strokes, which is what I have. Okay, I want to just to make life easier, I'm going to concentrate on two consequences of those two hypotheses and to treat those as the hypotheses that we're analysing. One is that a high saturated fat diet causes CVD via its effect on blood cholesterol, because somehow eventually cholesterol has sort of dropped out. Very few people now think that eating lots of egg yolk will kill you. It's the saturated fats that claim to be the effect, the antigen. That's the right concept. And secondly, a high cholesterol level, independently of how it got to be high, whether through dietary or other reasons, just a high cholesterol level causes CVD. Okay, so I'm going to give you one example of degeneration concerning the first hypothesis, and then several concerning the much more significant in terms of its sociological impact, second one. Okay, and it's sometimes called the French paradox. People think that, people who don't want to think that this is an important problem like to talk in terms of paradoxes here, as though this sort of tames them, but anyway, that's just a linguistic thing. Okay, so we're looking at this hypothesis, remember, that high saturated fat diet causes CVD via its effect on blood cholesterol. There's an immediate counter-evidence from the case of the French, who eat considerably more saturated fat than we in the UK do. They also smoke more and take less exercise. But they have fractionally higher average LDL levels, and I mean fractionally, and the same HDL. HDL is a so-called good cholesterol that we'll meet. But if incidentally as we go along, but if I explain everything, we'd not get to the end, so let me not worry about that for the time being. Yet, the rates of death from heart disease is not just lower than the UK rate, it's lower by 3/4, it's 1/4 of the UK rate. So it's a bit of a problem if you believe that high saturated fat diet causes CVD. And if you look more at you get more problems. It's not just the French. They actually have the highest rate of saturated fat consumption in Europe and the lowest rate of heart mortality. The Swiss, you'll be glad to know, Roman, have the second most saturated fat content of their diet, and they're the second lowest heart mortality. Sort of looks like a pattern's emerging, doesn't it? Russia has the lowest saturated fat and the highest heart mortality. All of this looks problematic for the thesis that it's a high saturated fat that causes heart fatality. Okay, so where's the degeneration? Well, the first response immediately was the French misclassify. They would, anyway, they're French after all. They don't do things proper when it comes to signing death certificates. We all know from COVID that it's not straightforward what you die of. I mean, people were being counted as dying from COVID when they came out of the clinic having just had a positive result for COVID and went under a bus. They were a death with COVID. I mean, eventually the BBC got to learn to say death with rather than death of, but originally it was, they counted in the deaths column for COVID anyway. So it's not straightforward what you die of, always. So that makes it, so it's ad hoc, but ad hoc's not a four-letter word. We should look and see whether there's any predictions here, whether it's independent testability that's the important thing. And this is independently testable. We just need to check French practices in terms of how they classify deaths. And if this response is correct, you'll find that the practice of recording CV death in France is out of line with that of other countries, leading to fewer deaths being attributed to CVD, cardiovascular disease. But the WHO did an investigation immediately, and they found that the French were doing exactly the same as everybody else. So you get independent testability, independent test, failed the independent test. Okay, so you've got to look somewhere else. So response 2 was that saturated fat consumption has not yet been high enough for long enough in France for its effect to be felt. Can't be right. I mean, they've been eating lots of saturated fat for a long time, but again, it's ad hoc, but ad hoc's not a four-letter word. There's a prediction, basically wait and see. Things will, eventually the French will catch up. Well, in terms of the deaths, not that you want to catch up in terms of the deaths, but this prediction was first made in 1998, and the French rate of CVD mortality has remained as relatively low as ever. So again, prediction, all right, it's not ad hoc in the nasty sense, it's independently testable, but its independent tests fail. Okay, so response 3, which is the one you all have had in your head straight away, because this is what gets the publicity. There's some contrary cause, or causes that protect the French against the impact of high saturated fat intake. And this is perfectly responsible. It's ad hoc, but ad hoc's not a four-letter word. It's what you do. You test apparent correlations for causal connection by trying to by bringing in other factors into account. So it's a perfectly respectable hypothesis, so long as it's specified. Obviously, if it just says there's some contrary cause, which I'm not going to tell you what it is, then that's gossified. That's a non-testable, non-independently testable prediction. But if you specify it, and it has been specified, then it becomes testable. So the list goes on quite long, but it contains of contrary causes that have been alleged. Garlic, eating a lot of garlic is one, which you would red wine is another, drinking more red wine, which French allegedly do. More likely cook vegetables than they have in the UK, although I think that's dying out, people are learning how to cook vegetables. But the problem is, of course, that none of these work. All attempts to make response 3 testable have led to empirical failure. The garlic one did actually initially look like it was going to be a success. There was a massive meta-analysis published. You should always be distrustful of meta-analyses, by the way, but it was published and it looked good. It showed a significant decrease in CVD death amongst those people who had a lot high garlic content in their diet compared to those who didn't. But it turned out that about 75% of the papers that had been involved in the meta-analysis were from alternative medicine journals, and the rest of the data came from the garlic pill industry. So when they did an actual RCT, then they found that there were in fact no significant differences between the groups receiving garlic and placebo. So they actually had an RCT in which some people were force-fed garlic and other people, I don't know how they made I shouldn't think this was a blind trial because it'd be hard to make the placebo taste like garlic. Anyway, the main concentrations of lipoproteins, that means cholesterol. And a group from Bonn followed up with another RCT and said we were actually surprised how clearly negative the results were. That is, there was no contrary effect of garlic. So again, we've got ad hoc response, but ad hoc is not a four-letter word. It was predicted. It did make predictions. The predictions turned out not to be correct. Okay, so now coming to, but many people are willing to give up the high saturated fat hypothesis, but this is really quite dominant in the hypothesis 2 is still dominant in medicine massively. So, okay, so remember hypothesis 2 said a high cholesterol level, independently of how it got to be high, let's forget the dietary stuff, whether through dietary or other reasons, causes higher rates of cardiovascular disease. Now, there's a whole series of studies culminating in this one which seem to show that low cholesterol levels increase mortality, not high ones. Well, not high ones, they said low ones. So here's a Honolulu study published in the highly prestigious Lancet in 2001. Our data accords with previous findings, that's why I said it's a series of articles, of increased mortality in elderly people with low serum cholesterol and show that long-term persistence of low cholesterol concentration actually increases the risk of death. Thus, the earlier that patients start to have low cholesterol concentrations, the greater the risk of death. These data cast doubt on the scientific justification for lowering cholesterol to very low levels, and boy, do people believe in lowering cholesterol to very low levels. I mean, there's some people who actually contemplate adding statins to drinking water, like fluoride, to get your levels low. For many people, there's no such thing as a safe level of cholesterol. It's like smoking. There's no safe level of smoking. So this was a culmination of a whole series of studies that found it was low cholesterol. Now, is that a problem? Well, it sort of doesn't fit in very well. It's perfectly possible that high cholesterol causes CVD and low cholesterol causes CVD. So but it's something that needs a response. And this is another illustration. It's not like physics where it's not relatively nice and crisp, where you've got a theory and you make a deduction of a consequence. You've got a single, deterministic hypothesis, usually, whereas here, as I say, we've got multifactorial stuff going on. It looks like a problem anyway. But people, again, had a response to this problem, namely that a falling or low cholesterol level is a sign of some underlying disease, and it's the disease that kills the people, not the low cholesterol level. Again, it's ad hoc, but ad hoc's not a four-letter word. It makes some predictions. It says, for example, that more people with diseases in the experimental arms, there'll be more people who have diseases, independently of getting eventually the CVD, in the experimental arms of these trials that show that the low cholesterol. But remember, we're testing now the hypothesis that the falling or low level of cholesterol is a sign of some underlying disease. But the people in these trials, including Framingham, which is the big, let me not talk about it, did not have overt diseases. So that looks like it's, again, ad hoc and testable, but not succeeding in the test. But people, again, had a response to that. In particular, a guy called Iribarren is famous for supporting this hypothesis. Incipient subclinical disease can do it, as much as a decade or more earlier than it becomes overt, and so can general frailty associated with aging. That is, can produce the higher rate of CVD death, and that being the reason why you get produce a lower cholesterol reading, and it's that disease that kills you, not the low cholesterol. So we got this response, but already that Honolulu study that I mentioned, in fact, in the light of our data, Iribarren's hypothesis is implausible and unlikely to account for the adverse effects of low cholesterol levels. They're being polite, actually. It's definitely worse than that. It's inconsistent with Iribarren's hypothesis. And there was an Austrian study following up on this, which found that it wasn't just the old and frail. Remember, one alternative was not incipient disease, which already sounds a bit gossy-fied, sort of 10 years earlier than it manifests itself, it can somehow make you have a lower cholesterol. The other alternative was that just general aging would lead to a low cholesterol level, and you're going to die of aging anyway. Austrian studies, for the first time we demonstrate that the low cholesterol effect occurs even amongst younger respondents, contradicting the previous theories that this is a proxy or marker for frailty occurring with age. So they found just amongst younger people that low cholesterol was a bad idea in terms of CVD, not a good idea, and that rather than the high cholesterol level. Okay, more famous, more telling, I think, perhaps, case of degeneration hypothesis 2, the so-called female paradox. Okay, so remember, hypothesis 2 essentially states that high cholesterol causes cardiovascular disease. There's a problem, another problem, across countries and across groups within countries, so Maoris in New Zealand and so on. A, with some exceptions, women have much lower rates of CVD than men do. And B, with some exceptions, women have considerably higher cholesterol levels than men do. So that looks like it's problematic. It's certainly ad hoc to think that women are protected by their sex hormones. It's an ad hoc response to that, to this state of affairs, which looks like it fits in not at all well with the high cholesterol causes CVD hypothesis. Responsible women are protected by their sex hormones. So again, it's like the garlic case of protection. Again, it's ad hoc, but ad hoc's not a four-letter word. In fact, it's perfectly normal scientific practice to try these things. So, and it makes all sorts of predictions, which might turn out to be correct. So, for example, it predicts that women who've had hysterectomies that also involved removal of their ovaries will show a higher rate of CVD than women who've had hysterectomies but ovaries were left intact. But already in 1963, it's amazing to me that this goes back so far, given later practices. A study found, hasten to add that this is an observational study, not a randomized intervention trial. It would have been about the most unethical randomized control trial you can think of it had it been there. We found no difference in the prevalence of coronary heart disease in the oophorectomized, that is the ones who had both womb and ovaries taken out, and hysterectomized, the ones who only had their womb taken out. Okay, so prediction 2, women have gone, so that's it's ad hoc, but testable, test turns negative. Prediction 2, women who've gone through the menopause should lose the protection and their CVD rate should move towards the same level as that observed in men, because they've lost their sex hormones, which are supposed to be doing the protecting. But again, this is known not to be true. Already in 1987, it was found that the normal menopause, which causes a gradual decrease in estrogen production, was not associated with any risk in the history of coronary heart disease. Well, let's not worry about the pill, but that's also negative. Prediction, but there's all sorts of predictions. Prediction 4, women prescribed hormone replacement therapy should show lower rates of CVD than women of similar ages not given hormone replacement therapy perimenopausally, because they've been given these estrogen and progesterone replacements. Yeah, that's it really. Gosh, time goes fast. And in fact, and despite these much earlier observations that I've already mentioned, in the 1990s, millions of women were being given HRT to reduce CVD risk as an explicit intervention. This was finally, again, there was an observational study that was done that seemed to support this hypothesis, and it's usually held out as demonstrating that you can never trust observational studies. What the answer is, you can't trust observational studies if they're obviously massively confounded by the fact that the sets of people involved were completely different. But anyway, eventually, when a randomized controlled trial was done, they like to have these nice acronyms. The heart and estrogen, given it's spelled American style, progestin replacement study, HERS, involved 2,763 women randomized to HRT or placebo. All had a history of heart disease, so it's a so-called secondary treatment. The primary endpoints were non-fatal myocardial infection or myocardial infarction or CHD, coronary heart disease death. There were primary events, either non-fatal MI or CHD death, in 176 women in placebo, 172 women on HRT. So that's a tiny difference, I mean absolutely nothing of 4. And moreover, when you looked at what you're really worried about, namely the deaths rather than the non-fatal MIs, there were actually 24% more fatalities in the HRT group, balanced by a 9% decline in, obviously, the many more non-fatal MIs to give you this overall tiny difference. It did increase side effects, and the people doing HARES said, based on the finding of no overall cardiovascular benefit, the investigators do not recommend starting this treatment for the purpose of secondary prevention of CHD. Okay, this was followed up by a test called the Women's Health Initiative study in 2002, which is an even larger RCT on HRT for primary prevention of CVD. I think that many acronyms are. And the result was after 5.2 years, there was a 29% increase in coronary heart disease risk, including an 18% increase in risk of CHD mortality and a 32% increase in risk of non-fatal myocardial infarction. There was a 20% increase in the risk of fatal stroke and a 50% increase in the risk of non-fatal stroke in women assigned to HRT compared to placebo. Okay, then, so people still want to hold on to this claim that high cholesterol levels increase your risk of CVD. And so again, they make a response to this negative. So we've got ad hoc, testable, test failed. So then people started saying that the first response to the difficulty posed by these statistics about women compared to men had been wrong. It wasn't that female sex hormones protect against CVD, that it was the fact that generally women have higher total, or well, they have, what really explains the fact that generally women have higher total or LDL cholesterol but lower rates of CVD is that they have higher rates, higher levels of HDL, high density lipoproteins, so-called good cholesterol. Okay, well, again, it's ad hoc. Ad hoc's not a four-letter word, so you can test it. You can see whether that's true or not. And people look back at the HERS study, and already there, it was noted as a result, another result of that study, that HDL went up in the HRT treatment group, but so did CVD mortality. And there was a Russian study in '94 found no association of HDL cholesterol with mortality in Russian women. Okay, I think I better I hate to miss the ApoA1 Milano story because it's so nice, but let me just at least feast your eyes on this wonderful place. I want to be in this hotel here with a swimming pool because I remember it's very cold in Italian lakes. Eating a high saturated fat diet, so lots of meatballs and salted vodka alla romano, not hold back on the pasta. Anyway, there's an interesting story. I can tell it in the discussion if we've got time. Okay, so it basically says that it's not HDL itself that's protective. It's a special type of HDL. Let me not do it because I would mess it up. Okay. It is fascinating. That's a shame I can't tell this story. Okay, so now some internal, external history. Lakatosi's second most famous paper, The History of Science and Its Rational Reconstruction, of course has this idea that of internal and external history, that internal history is what you would expect to happen given whatever methodology you take to specify what good science is. And external history comes in when real history and its rational reconstruction diverge. So each methodology philosophy provides via the internal history it dictates a rational reconstruction, that is, an account of how things ought to have gone in science. When history differs from its rational reconstruction, external history provides an empirical, really empirically testable explanation of why it differs, and if it's testable in the proper context. So a methodology of science gets brownie points from the acceptance of some theory in science. Lakatosian idea of testing methodologies against one another, just in case it either delivers the judgment that acceptance of that theory was rational according to the standards it specifies, or it entails acceptance of the theory was not rational, but there's an empirically confirmed external historical account of the divergence. So suppose I'm right that the research programs based on both hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2 are degenerated, and that when you feed in these other factors you get to a negative assessment of the evidence. Still, the fact is that both hypotheses, and especially 2, are widely accepted and form the basis for dietary advice and medical practice for millions and millions of people worldwide. So the defender of MSRP, given that the MSRP judgment seems to be that these are degenerating and therefore should be rejected, needs some external history. So one more example. Imre only ever had one example of this phenomenon, namely the Lysenko affair in Russia. But here's another example where we've got to explain why did so many people believe that a high rate of cholesterol is a danger for cardiovascular disease if the research program based on that has degenerated. And okay, you've got to come up with some external history and hope that history is supported. Yeah, so I think it was Bloor, one of those Edinburgh strong program people anyway, who said that Lakatosi's view is that sociology is for deviants. You bring in sociology only when people get it wrong, and not surprisingly as a sociologist he wasn't too happy with that. But actually the sociology here is much more interesting than the philosophy. I think the philosophy is straightforward, it's definitely degenerating research programs. But the telling the story of how the wrong decisions being made in medicine at present is altogether more interesting. It's sociological, obviously, factual, descriptive, it's fascinating and complex. And I've obviously not got time to tell it because I'm already more or less out of time. But it is fascinating. I wish I had, this is one of the few times when I wish I had PhD students, because this I think would be a fascinating, this whole story would be fascinating, both the methodology and the history would be fascinating thesis. So the answer, the key, but my no means only, is money in the form of Big Pharma. This is Henry Gadsden, who for a long time was the CEO of Merck, which for a long time was the most profitable pharmaceutical company in the world. And he's famous for saying, I want to sell drugs to everyone. I want to sell drugs to healthy people. I want drugs to sell like chewing gum. He actually said, I think, like Wrigley sells chewing gum, I want to sell drugs. And he realized that, you know, the clue to doing that, and to actually the pharmaceutical companies were having a dip in fortune at that time, the way to cure that was to not just treat ill people, but people at risk of being ill, which is everyone basically. And he made that remark in 1976, and in the 40 years to 2016, the profits of the big pharmaceutical companies increased 40-fold. Much of it due to selling drugs to treat risk rather than overt illness. This is to be said like the Daleks say, exterminate, exterminate, statinate, statinate. Statins have been the big blockbuster drug to beat all blockbusters. At peak, statins were bringing in circa $5 billion US per annum in, oh, my screen is not also here now. And the estimated total profit from all statins has been upwards of $1 trillion. The selling point of statins is, of course, that they reduce cholesterol levels. And crucially, by reducing cholesterol level, they reduce CVD risk. I mean, you don't want a lower cholesterol level, you don't want to have a cardiovascular disease. So Big Pharma is really committed to spreading the gospel ring hypothesis too. They really got very strong financial interest in doing that. The sugar industry, by the way, has played a similar role with respect to hypothesis one. If you can tell people to have lots of carbs, i.e. sugars, then that's good for it. And lots of soft drinks, not going to do any harm allegedly. If you doubt the power of Big Pharma, if you think I'm exaggerating things, then you should read this wonderful book by Marcia Angel, who used to be the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. There's just no doubt that despite some regulatory efforts which have not succeeded, Big Pharma continues to increase its control over trials themselves, especially the large ones. They're the only ones that can afford to finance the very large ones that are sometimes needed for, quote, needed, taken to be needed for a very small effect. And over their publication, what gets published and what doesn't. And conductors of trials as well as influencers, for example, those on the committees who decided that the cut-off point for high cholesterol should be lowered, are conflicted. I've got some quotes here about, talk about seeming to refute a claim but actually supporting it. I don't believe a word about the conflict of interest, says this guy from Professor Castellijn from Amsterdam. I don't believe a word about the conflict of interest because there's not a single opinion leader in the medical world who has not done any work for a pharmaceutical company in terms of research or trials. So everybody's conflicted, so apparently nobody is. And Daniel Simon certainly says most conflicted researchers are not truly expert. To the extent that, and this is Marcia Angel again, and not somebody who's a raving left-winger or anything, but as I said, editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, it's simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that's published or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reached slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Okay, well, money isn't the whole story, but there's a big motive there, obviously, for you to believe that high cholesterol levels are bad for risk of CVD, and that given that statins do have a small, very small effect on cholesterol level, that they're a good thing to have and therefore make money for the pharmaceutical company. It's certainly not the whole story. There's lots of issues of personal reputation, professional pride, of group phenomena of groupthink. There's a role of guidelines and regulatory bodies in all this that needs to be disentangled. But current clinical research, especially in this regard, does sadly seem to exemplify the golden rule, which of course states that he who has the gold makes the rules. Okay, so conclusion, I think if you look at it as a, if you look at these things as a research program, the defense thereof, there's all these ad hoc maneuvers that people have made to try and defend the claim that high cholesterol in particular is a risk factor, as a major risk factor for CVD. They all the ones I know, and I've not shown you the whole picture obviously by any means, but some parts of it, they all lead to clear cases of Lakatosian degeneration. Despite that, it's continued to be believed and to be acted upon that high cholesterol levels are bad for CVD, and the reason for that needs to be disentangled, but a large part of the story is the money. Okay, so that's it. Thank you very much if you've been listening. Oh, if you wanted some further reading, either of these two books are wonderful by a guy called Malcolm Kendrick. Okay, if you have been, thanks for listening. Thank you.